the kind of format of the meeting. So we have a Zoom link there for you, which you obviously found. We intend to record this, so we probably put it on YouTube. So feel free to turn your cameras off. We have the materials available here. The agenda link, which you found as well, and there's also a Slido. So I've given you 3 options for a Slido. There's a tiny URL, there's the full one, and you can go to Slido and enter the event code or use the QR code. We're going to start off with some brief introductions to a variety of sessions. So we start off with a welcome and introduction and then have a Slido survey. If I go to the slides, so just some housekeeping rules. Mute your microphones, please, especially if you've got some background noise or if you're in a kind of a co-working space. We'll be following the Elixir Code of Conduct, so essentially being respectful, courteous, and inclusive of colleagues and allowing them a safe space to express their opinions and to be heard. The full code is linked there if you want to have a look. There's a few of us present on the call. If you have any issues, please contact us. As I said, we're recording the call, and there's a notes document with the agenda, so feel free to help us to take some notes. So we have some introductory presentations to a variety of subtopics for WorkflowHub. After that, we have some questions. What we intend to do is try and keep to the schedule, but obviously some may kind of overflow into the next session, so we'll try and be a little bit flexible. So if I go to the Slido, if you can all fill this in, we just basically want to collect some background information on the participants. So if I press play on this, can you all see that?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. So I'll wait for people to answer that. I'll give it a couple of minutes. Full disclosure, I've never run Slido before. So if anyone wants to tell me if I'm doing something wrong, please do. So we've got like 15 people present. We've got 7 answers so far. So this is basically asking, what is your experience of WorkflowHub or using WorkflowHub? And also if you've never heard of it. So that's interesting. So a lot of people have never heard of it here, or heard of it, or okay. So I think probably that's all the answers we're going to get. I'll move on to the next one. So this one, essentially, we want to know which projects you're representing here, because obviously we targeted this towards some of the projects we work on. But if we have other projects that are interested in WorkflowHub, that would be useful to know as well. So you've got BGE, Ergo. Is this appearing as a cloud for anyone?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let's go into the next question. So this one's asking which workflow system or which language you use, and this you can have multiple answers to this. So there's some of the common ones: Galaxy, Nextflow, and then other. We've got other. Okay. So feel free to jot those in the minutes document as well, actually. Right. Next question. Where do you store your workflows? So that can be Git, Google Drive, some other kind of repository online. Okay, and the last question. All right. So, okay, so here there's a Q&A where you can pop any questions at any point. I'll be trying to keep track of those. Manaz is running the Zoom, and Finn is doing the presenting. So I think, unless I missed anything, Manaz, are we ready to go?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, great. Okay, take it away then, Finn.
Okay, share my screen. Is that working for everyone?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm Finn. I'm the developer technical lead of WorkflowHub. And in this first session, I'm just going to give you a very brief introduction to what WorkflowHub is. As we could see from the Slido, some people have never heard of it before. So basically what WorkflowHub is it's a registry of workflows. And this is needed because the kind of workflow landscape is very fragmented, usually between different workflow systems. So WorkflowHub is a place where workflows of any kind can be registered, can be searched over. You can cite your workflows. We make use of lots of open standards to kind of make your workflows fair. So that's why WorkflowHub exists. It was initially developed as an EOSC Life project, and we partner with Australian Biocommons and lots of other communities. It's very much a community-driven project. We have the WorkflowHub Club, which meets every 2 weeks, and that's how we kind of get our direction and requirements. It's the core service of Elixir, which is a EU research infrastructure, and yes, it's registered in the EOS service catalog, and the management is kind of shared between various people in the UK and Belgium and in Australia as part of the Biocommons project. So this is WorkflowHub. This is what you'd see if you went to WorkflowHub right now. There's links in the slides, by the way, if you want to follow along. Most of the slides have links that you can click on, and they're linked from the agenda doc. There's various statistics at the side, which are probably out of date now, but we have over 300 workflows across 16 different workflow systems, and this is extendable. You can register workflows from a system that we've never heard of before. That's all completely fine, and I'll talk about that in the upcoming sessions. We have over 400, almost 500 registered contributors distributed across 165 teams. Again, I'll talk about what our team is in the near future, and the collection as well. And those are accesses and download stats, although they're probably inaccurate, like I said. This is a very brief overview of some of the features of WorkflowHub. So the intention of WorkflowHub is to be a registry. It's not a repository. So as much as we can, we integrate with existing systems and registries, including Git. So we have quite strong Git integration. It's agnostic to your workflow management system. You can upload anything and then later describe what it is. We have a versioning system, so you don't have to have your perfect finalized workflow. It can be very much a work in progress. We have ways of indicating that a maturity level indication. So you can say that, yes, your workflow is a work in progress or it is stable, because there is value in sharing kind of workflows that haven't been finished yet. And we acknowledge this. You can link off to various things that aren't workflows, like documentation, test data, protocols, publications. So we don't just support workflows. There are various other types of things you can register in WorkflowHub. We extract metadata from workflows as much as we can. We kind of have support for various workflow management systems formats, but we also kind of work with some open standards as well, like bioschemas, citation file format. And yeah, we kind of expose our metadata in WorkflowHub through those open standards as well. So we're not just kind of pulling things in. We're kind of making ourselves open as well for integration with other systems. In particular, we use the TRS API, J for JH's Tools Registry Service API. And this allows services such as Galaxy to actually find workflows in WorkflowHub, pull them in for execution. So that's an example of an API standard that we support. Bio.tools integration. So bio.tools is a registry of tools. So naturally, it makes sense for us to integrate with them. So we actually support extracting tools from certain workflow formats, such as Galaxy, and linking off to bio.tools. So you can get more information about which tools are used in a workflow. Credit and citation is a very big part of WorkflowHub. So we ensure all the workflow creators are credited appropriately, and we have an easy way to kind of copy citations into publications, etc. We allow minting of DOIs for workflows. So once you've submitted your workflow to WorkflowHub, you can opt to register a DOI for it, and that uses DataCite in the backend. So that gives you, yeah, a nice thing that you can cite in a publication, etc. That was a very brief intro. I don't know if there's any questions so far, but if there are now, this would be a time to ask. If not, I'll probably just move on to the next session, because there'll probably be more questions as I get into the...
Yep. There's no questions in the chat.
Cool.
or on the slide at the moment.
I'll just take the time now to kind of introduce some other people on the call. May not have joined yet, but we've got Stuart Owen, who is the developer of Seek, which is the platform that WorkflowHub is based on. And we're going to have Stian. I don't know if he's joined yet. He's very much involved in the workflow community and research objects. There is a question: what is the advantage of using WorkflowHub? So basically, it's to make your workflow fair. This may not be important to you, but I'm not going to evangelize why fair is a good thing here, but basically we provide tooling to make workflows fair, so make them findable, make them accessible, interoperable through use of open standards, and hopefully reusable. I think a lot of kind of funded projects now have those requirements in place. So WorkflowHub is basically a service that can help you get there. And hopefully some more advantages would become clear as we go on through the sessions. Okay, so I'll immediately move on to the first session, which is all about kind of organizing your space in WorkflowHub and your workflows, and how you can kind of represent your projects in WorkflowHub. Just seen another question about bio.tools. So bio.tools is a tools registry. So there's basically, well, you can go to it and find out more. It's literally just bio.tools is the URL. But it kind of, it's a registry of like different parts of a workflow. So your workflow might use various tools, like command line tools, maybe other workflows. And these are all kind of described on bio.tools. And there's lots of kind of great metadata. It's curated. They have a team of curators. So you can get lots of details about how a tool works, links to documentation, and things like that. Is WorkflowHub linked to Tess? I do not believe it is. Tess is the Elixir's training registry. There was some experimental work done to pull in events and materials from Tess into Seek, which is the platform that WorkflowHub is based on. These aren't enabled on WorkflowHub, but it's something we can definitely investigate if that's a thing that people would find useful. Okay, so I'll just go into some of the concepts to help you organize things on WorkflowHub. So there's 3 things I'm going to talk about in the session: teams, spaces, and collections. Teams are the main kind of organizational unit of WorkflowHub. So basically everything in WorkflowHub is assigned to 1 or more teams, and the users of WorkflowHub can be members of teams. And you have a membership of a team through your institution, and you can also be in multiple teams. And a workflow or any resource on WorkflowHub can be jointly owned by a team. It doesn't have to be a single team. There's a lot of flexibility in how you can make use of teams, which I'll talk about in the next slide. Spaces are kind of level up above teams, so they're a way of grouping teams that are kind of working together on an activity or in a funded project maybe. It's kind of a wrapper around the team, basically. And finally, we have collections, which are kind of an arbitrary grouping of workflows or other resources in WorkflowHub. So these can be used, for example, maybe you have variants of a workflow, you want to kind of keep them all together. You can put them in a collection, and collections are kind of curated and maintained by people. So all the content in there is going to be kind of grouped around a particular theme or use case. And there's a link at the bottom of this slide, which kind of goes onto our documentation page, which has some more information about organizing things on WorkflowHub. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about teams. So like I said, this is kind of the main organizational unit of WorkflowHub. The other 2 concepts are kind of optional, but in WorkflowHub, you must be a member of a team to submit content. There's a screenshot on the right of an example of a team. So like you can see, you can have like a logo, description of what the team is for, links to some funding codes if that's applicable, if it's a funded project. Also links to kind of websites or discussion channels. So when you register with WorkflowHub and you opt to create a team, this is something that requires approval. This is mainly to kind of prevent spam, but it's something we're looking into kind of relaxing in the future. But it kind of helps us keep those teams nice and curated. But yeah, a team is basically a way of kind of crediting a group or a kind of activity that has produced some content or a workflow. And as well as kind of giving credit to that activity, it can also be a way of providing ownership and permissions. So you might have workflows on WorkflowHub that you want to be kind of maintained by a group of people. Teams would be a way to do this. We also have sharing policies in WorkflowHub. So you may not want your workflow entry to be immediately visible. You might want to just kind of be trying things out. You can opt to make your workflow kind of private, but share it with members of your team. And you can obviously give people in your team rights to edit that workflow entry. So the burden isn't just on a single maintainer. Teams can belong to a space, like I mentioned, or they can be independent. So maybe there isn't a kind of overarching project that manages the team. It might be an independent team. So this would be appropriate if it's a kind of small project. But also, yeah, a team might be kind of a subgroup of a larger project, and you might want to use a space to represent that larger project. And there's a link at the bottom to, I think it's this particular team that's on the screenshot, or you can look through the list and see other examples of teams there. Spaces, like I said, they're groupings of teams. So I know we've got some BioDT people on the call, so this is the example that's shown on the right-hand side. So BioDT is kind of quite a larger project, and it's made up of various kind of use cases, which may each be individually producing workflows. So in this case, we've opted to create a space for BioDT. Again, you can have a description, logo, links to funding details and websites. And then within that space, we have individual teams for each workspace, each use case, sorry. Again, this is something that requires admin approval, but once you have created a space, you can then kind of self-manage that space, and you can create any number of teams within that. So it's kind of like a self-managing area of WorkflowHub. So yeah, this would be appropriate for larger projects, consortiums. For example, Australian Biocommons has a space with all the activities under that as individual teams. So yeah, I think that kind of sums up the use cases for the spaces. So collections are kind of the most flexible way of organizing things on WorkflowHub. Basically, what you do is you create a collection, and then you can browse to any resource on WorkflowHub and add it to that collection. And this kind of allows collections to be used for various use cases. So maybe you have a group of workflows that are kind of intended to be used together. You might want to group those into a collection. You might have, well, the example shown in the screenshot are kind of workflows from different systems that are performing the same tasks, so variants of a workflow. So you can group these into a collection as well. It's basically any way you could think about grouping workflows, collections would be the way to do this. So they're curated and maintained as well, so you can have multiple people that maintain a collection, add things to that collection, and kind of keep it up to date. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about collections. And so some common features of these organizational concepts in WorkflowHub are mainly filtering. So when you're browsing workflows, you can filter for workflows in any of these concepts, so in spaces and teams and collections. And also for spaces and teams, we kind of have like a admin analytics dashboard, so you can see, what are the most accessed and viewed resources within a space or team, and various other things which you can see in the screenshot on the left there. So some future activities around the kind of theme of organization is streaming the registration process. So like I said, currently teams and spaces require approval before you can start using WorkflowHub. We're kind of looking into removing this barrier so you can kind of just immediately create your team without admin approval, and we can kind of deal with curation after the fact. and also kind of making the links between workflows more explicit. So I mentioned you can put things in a collection, but we would like in the future to have kind of explicit links between workflows. So if you're looking at a workflow entry that has variants, you can see the listing of variants somewhere on the page, and sub workflows as well. So that's all I wanted to say for the first session. If there are any questions, you can either put them in Slido or you can raise your hand and we can answer them.
So there's one question just popped up in Slido. What do I actually upload to WorkflowHub?
So this may be answered in the next session, but there are various ways of submitting things to WorkflowHub. You can import things from Git, you can import things from existing places on the web, or you can upload workflows directly. So if you have a workflow file on your computer, you can upload that to WorkflowHub if it doesn't exist somewhere else. What you actually upload largely depends on the workflow format. Some workflow formats are kind of bundled together in a single file. Other workflow formats, you kind of have lots of little files that kind of need to be kept together. So in that case, it probably makes more sense to use a Git repository and keep everything in there. But we can go into that further in session 2.
There's one more question. Is a collection currently the only way to link workflows?
No, we do have a feature called attribution, where you can basically link a workflow to another workflow. So within WorkflowHub, within the interface, there's a kind of section in the UI where you can link to other relevant workflows, but the kind of issue there is we don't have a way of describing what the link is between the workflows yet. So you can kind of say this workflow is linked to this workflow, but you can't quite say how. So that's why collections can be good, as they can kind of describe why things are related rather than just saying this is related to that. Can you link workflows across multiple spaces teams? Yes. So a workflow can be owned by multiple teams, but also you could have a collection with workflows that are from different teams. There's no restriction there. And yeah, it might make sense to have a workflow that is owned by multiple teams. So maybe it's a workflow that was produced by some activity, some kind of working group. But then there's also some funding from a project that's also contributing to that workflow's development. So in that case, maybe you're going to have 2 teams, one for the kind of original activity that produced the workflow, and one for the kind of contributing activity. So that, yeah, that's an example of when you want to have multiple teams linked to a workflow. Just seen another question. Can we report non-functioning workflows? Yes, so we have the ability to provide, so when you create your entry on WorkflowHub, one of the fields lets you define a discussion channel. Basically, this is a web link to somewhere on the internet where you can go to discuss that workflow or get help. So maybe this would be like, if you're using GitHub, it might be the issues page on GitHub. So that's kind of a way to funnel people towards a space where they can get help. Can you specify an open source license that applies to all workflows in a funded project? Yes, you can define on the team level, you can define a default license. And we have a whole list of licenses you can choose from, including probably all the popular open source licenses. And then when someone opts to create a workflow and link it with that team, it will set that license by default on the workflow. We also have ways of kind of extracting license information from workflow metadata, which I'll talk about in the next session.
Okay, I don't see any more questions on Slido.
Okay, so we're ahead of schedule, but I'll continue. Okay, so this section is kind of about setting up your Git repository, but I guess before we start, I'll just say, why might you want to use Git for your workflows? Well, it's because we kind of consider workflows to be software. So all the issues to do with software kind of apply to workflows as well. So maybe you want to kind of track changes between versions. You want multiple people to kind of contribute to the development of your workflow. So I think Git kind of provides a natural solution to a lot of these problems. So we have various ways in which we support Git in WorkflowHub. And I'm saying Git, not just GitHub, because we support GitLab or any Git repository that's accessible on the internet, because we're making use of the Git protocol. So largely this feature involves importing Git repositories. So you've got your Git repository on the web somewhere with your workflow in it, and you want to kind of quickly and easily submit that to WorkflowHub. We have a feature that allows you to do that. We kind of provide a way to browse and preview files within that kind of imported repository from the WorkflowHub UI. And we have the ability to synchronize with the upstream repository. So once you've imported your workflow, maybe you've made some changes to it in the original repository, there's ways to kind of synchronize those changes back to WorkflowHub. We're kind of flexible in the repository structure we support in WorkflowHub. So basically, you can import any kind of Git repository into WorkflowHub. And then we kind of ask for some metadata. So to say, like, what is the main workflow? And I'll give a brief demo of this in a bit. But today we kind of wanted to mention some of the best practices that you can practice with your Git repository to kind of have the most streamlined experience of using WorkflowHub. So this is kind of a summary of some of the things we think would help. So the first one is possibly controversial, but the easiest way to integrate with WorkflowHub currently is to have a single workflow in your repository. This kind of makes it easier to kind of keep track of what changes affected what workflow, because if you had lots of workflows in the same repository, you may run into issues with kind of versioning, like if you change one workflow but not another, how do you kind of synchronize that with WorkflowHub? And also, you know, if you're using something like GitHub, you've got the issues page. It's kind of easier if all your issues are around a specific subject. So having a single workflow in a repository kind of makes things a bit easier to organize. We recommend including a license, obviously. this kind of indicates what things people can do with your workflow. If you don't have a license, then kind of legally, people aren't really allowed to reuse it, but having a license in there kind of says exactly what they can do with the workflow, what they can't do, how they should attribute usage of that workflow, etc. It's good practice to include citation CFF file, which I'm going to describe shortly. But basically, this is a way of making sure all the kind of authors behind the workflow are credited in a structured and accessible way. And there's various other pieces of metadata you can put in there. It's a kind of standardized file format. It's parsable by GitHub and various other systems. It's quite lightweight and flexible. So we use that in WorkflowHub to kind of extract various bits of metadata, which I'll demonstrate shortly. So tags are a Git concept to kind of flag a particular version. And it's good practice to make use of tags to kind of say, you know, this is a snapshot of this workflow in a certain point in time. You know, maybe it's kind of stable now. I want to tag it as version 1, or maybe I've made some changes to the workflow. Let's call it version 1.2. So it's kind of good practice to kind of keep tagging your repository in Git whenever you've made like a significant change. And this also makes it easier to import to WorkflowHub, which I'll show shortly. So I'll just talk a little bit about the citation file format. So that's an example on the right-hand side of a CFF file. Basically, I've kept it very sparse in this example. I've added a title and I've listed a couple of authors. So I added me and Stuart. And I also mentioned a license in there as well. So yeah, it's quite a very accessible format. It's very lightweight. I think it's using YAML, so it's machine readable by applications such as WorkflowHub, but also it's quite readable from a human's perspective as well. So it's not too much effort to kind of edit and produce that by hand if needed. I linked to various websites where you can find a bit more info on this format, and there's also a little JavaScript application you can use to generate this, which I use for this particular example. And yeah, WorkflowHub will pick up this file if it's present in your repository, and it will extract metadata from there. Yeah, so I talked about tagging basically. It's a great way to kind of flag the stages of development of your workflow. I've linked to semantic versioning, which is a way of structuring your versions or tags of your workflow. But you know, this is just a suggestion. You can tag it however you want. Maybe you want to, maybe you did your workflow as part of some hackathon, so you want to tag it as hackathon 2023. That's fine. There's not very many restrictions there. Just however is useful to you and your group. You can also make use of GitHub releases as well if you kind of want to include more information about what has changed in your workflow between versions. This kind of lets you add like notes to your version of a workflow as well. And I'm just going to briefly give a practical example of
Sorry, Finn, can I just interrupt 1 second?
Yeah.
There's a few questions. Do you want to do them now or after the demo?
I'll do them at the end because we have a session and some of these might be answered by
Okay.
this.
Okay.
So this is a very basic example that I've added to GitHub of how you could structure a repository. So it's a very basic Galaxy workflow. It's just a single file, but obviously you guys are probably working with more complex examples than this. I've added a citation CFF file, which is the one I showed in the slide. I'm going to zoom in a bit because I imagine this is very small for you guys. So yeah, it's just crediting some of the people, some of the authors. And I added a diagram as well, which is basically a screenshot of how this workflow looks on Galaxy. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the development instance of WorkflowHub. So this is dev.workflowhub.eu. This is our kind of sandbox area that we use to test things out. So if you want to try out WorkflowHub features without kind of messing up the main instance, this would be the place to go and do that. So I'm going to click the contribute button. And here we can see the registration page for a workflow. So there's various options on the left, like I mentioned before. You can upload a workflow directly from your computer using like local files, or maybe it's a file that's on the web. You can add that as a URL. Import a Git repository, which I'm going to do, or upload an RO crate, which I'm not going to cover in detail in this session today, but basically RO crates are a way of bundling together things. In this case, it could be a workflow. So it's basically you have all the workflow files zipped up together in a zip file, along with metadata that describes them. So let's import my Git repository. So it's expecting the URL for the repository. So I'll copy and paste that from GitHub into WorkflowHub. And now WorkflowHub is behind the scenes, it's pulling in the repository. But before it does that, it wants me to kind of select what version of the repository I want to include. So that could be a branch or a tag. I'm going to select a tag to begin with. And I'm going to select 0.1.1. So these are kind of pre-released versions, the convention is. So if it starts with a 0, that kind of indicates it's a pre-release. So now it takes me to the next page. And what I need to do here is kind of tell WorkflowHub what file in that repository is the kind of main workflow. Because maybe you have a single workflow that calls out to sub workflows and they're all in the same repository. WorkflowHub needs to know like what's the entry point for that workflow. So I click the file selector and it shows me a list of all the files in the Git repository. And I'll select this GA file, which is my Galaxy workflow. Underneath that field, you can see there's the workflow type. It automatically gets detected as Galaxy based on the file extension. But yeah, you can also manually choose from that list. Also, you can choose to add a new workflow type if you want, which I'm going to talk about in the third session, because the set of workflow types in WorkflowHub is extensible. Abstract CWL, I'm going to skip over for now, but I'll describe that as well in session 3 about what that means. But this is optional, and the diagram is optional as well, but I'm going to point to my diagram file that I included. And I'll continue. So now what happens in the background is WorkflowHub does some metadata extraction. There's various pieces of the repository it's looking at. So the citation file, like I described, it looks at, it will look at the README as well and add that as a description. And depending on the workflow format, it will do some parsing of that format. So we have dedicated support for the Galaxy format, so it can extract metadata directly from that file. So I can scroll through, check all the metadata is correct. It's got the source correct. I can also add topics and operations. These come from the EDAM ontology. So maybe I want to say it's the computer science workflow. You can tag it however you want. Maturity level, this lets us indicate, is this workflow a work in progress? Is it kind of stable, production ready? It's very much a work in progress, so I'll indicate that here. I can choose which team should own the workflow. I'm a member of multiple teams, so I see all my teams in this list. If you're just a member of one team, it will automatically select that team. It's picked out the MIT license, which was described in the citation metadata file. And here, this is where I can add discussion channels. So maybe there's somewhere where people can go to get help. So let's link to my GitHub issues page. I'll put that in here. Now I can choose how visible this entry is. Maybe I don't want to share it with everyone just for now. I could make it private, so no access. Or I can make it downloadable. WorkflowHub administration is the team that is owning this workflow, so I can maybe give them some extra permissions to edit the entry as well, or manage the entry. And also you can flexibly share with other teams as well. Maybe you want to give another team some access. You can see all the teams here. You can restrict that access to members of a particular institution in a particular team if you would like. Or you could maybe just share with an individual person. So let's let Stuart manage my workflow. So we have a very kind of powerful and flexible permission system, which comes from the underlying platform of WorkflowHub. Yeah, you can add arbitrary tags. I think this tag was extracted from the Galaxy workflow file. And the kind of authors, these are what was specified in the citation CFF file. So these have been extracted along with the kind of ORCID and affiliation. And here is where I could link off to other resources in WorkflowHub. So maybe there's some presentations or documents that are related to this workflow and they're registered on WorkflowHub. I can add them here, but I'm not going to do that for now. You can also manually tag tools that are associated with the workflow, and this query is bio.tools. So if my workflow used BioRuby, maybe, I can associate that manually here. But we do support also automated detection of tools from certain workflow formats. So now my entry is registered on WorkflowHub. You can see all the metadata I provided is here. There's a little yellow badge to say it's work in progress. We've got the diagram. Some of the workflow structure is extracted from the Galaxy file. And we kind of have various levels of support for different workflow formats that we can pull this information from. On the right here, you can see I could generate a DOI for this entry if I wanted to, which I'm not going to do. And obviously you've got the kind of creator credit on the right. And then links to view it on GitHub, download it as an RO crate. Various other things you can do with the workflow entry here as well. What I'll just show briefly is what if I wanted to kind of update this with a new version of the workflow that's been created on GitHub, let's say. I'll click the new version button. I'm going to point it to the same repository, but maybe if your workflow has moved to a different repository, you can change it here. That's no problem. And I'm going to select version 0.2. And again, this pulls in and refreshes the metadata from that latest version. So the title's changed here, but everything else I'm going to keep the same. And there's a new author in this version, which is Stian. So that's how you can refresh a WorkflowHub entry from GitHub. And you can see the list of versions here. So I can go back to version 1 if I wanted to. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to show for this brief demo. I'll go back to the presentation. Can skip these slides. They were just in case the demo didn't work. Something we want to look at in future work is kind of automating this submission from the GitHub side to WorkflowHub. So instead of having to go to WorkflowHub to create the entry, you could tie it into your GitHub actions, or you can use the GitHub app. And this would kind of automatically push it to WorkflowHub with all the required metadata. And this would be useful as well for kind of synchronizing. You wouldn't need to do the manual pull from the WorkflowHub side. It would all be done automatically behind the scenes. And yeah, like I said, we're advising one workflow per repository, but obviously that is not always the case. We do support workflow repositories that have multiple workflows. You just basically choose the particular workflow for this entry as the main workflow. But we want to have kind of dedicated support for these kind of collection repositories to say, look, you can just import the one repository and then WorkflowHub will kind of pull out all the workflows it needs to from that collection of workflows. Okay, so onto the questions. I can see there's quite a few already, so I'll just start going through those. Can you link to a private Git repository? Short answer is no. Basically, WorkflowHub needs to be able to communicate with the Git repository, and if it's private, there's no way to supply WorkflowHub with the credentials to pull that in. So currently, we're only supporting publicly accessible Git repositories.
Could I just say, I think you could still do it by hand and still link to it, couldn't you? Or maybe this is that bad practice.
What do you mean, like download the files from GitHub and submit it manually?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, you could do that if you wanted to. You could download the zip file from your private Git repository and upload that to WorkflowHub.
Because
if
I
you
could
wanted to do
still
that.
restrict the download. I can remove download permission, right?
Yeah, so if you, I don't know,
Yeah.
you just wanted to advertise your workflow, but without actually
Yeah,
allowing people to download it, you could have a view only entry in WorkflowHub so people can find it, but they can't actually access the workflow content. Yeah, you could do that. I'm not entirely sure why you'd want to, but that is something we'd support. if you edit the workflow description in WorkflowHub when you imported it from Git, then go and update the README on Git, can you pull the edits into WorkflowHub? Yes. Well, so what would happen is when you imported it from Git the second time, well, so the way you do this would be you'd pull in the new version into GitHub, into WorkflowHub, sorry. So you'd pull the new version, and then the changes that you had made on the Git repository would then be pulled back into WorkflowHub. So yeah, we do allow this kind of re-import of metadata. But obviously, if you change the description on WorkflowHub, these changes would be overwritten by what's coming back in from the Git side. Is there a way to incorporate the branching from Git in WorkflowHub? So is this referring to, say, if you have a workflow that is a fork of another workflow? I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I was thinking like if you have a workflow where you have different sets of parameters for different scenarios,
Right.
but the structure of the workflow is the same. But so, for example, we work in junior assembly, we might have a plant branch or a fungus branch or an animal branch.
Yeah. So if you had all those branches in the same repository, this would be fine. You'd basically just import that repository multiple times, but selecting a different branch each time. So you can select which branch you want to pull the metadata from. So then you'd have kind of multiple entries in WorkflowHub for each kind of branch or variant of that workflow.
You'd have to have them in a collection to make it explicit.
Yeah, currently, yeah, you'd then create a collection and include each branch in there to kind of wrap them. But yeah, what we want to do in the future is kind of improve this linking between workflow entries.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question. How do I connect a GitHub tag to a version on WorkflowHub? So yeah, basically how I showed, when you import the workflow, it shows you a list of the tags from the Git repository, and you select which one you want to include, and this is then tied to that tag and that revision. When importing from GitHub, can I create the workflow file in WorkflowHub, or do I need to create it beforehand? You can. So if I understand this correctly, you can have an entry in WorkflowHub that's not linked to GitHub, and then in the future you can choose to link that to a Git repository. So for example, maybe you uploaded some files to WorkflowHub, but then decided, oh wait, actually this might be better off in GitHub. You could put those files in GitHub and then link that GitHub repository to the WorkflowHub entry without having to create a new entry. I hope that answers the question, by the way. I wasn't entirely sure what it means. What is the difference between edit and manage permissions? Basically, edit is editing of the metadata, whereas manage lets you change the permissions or delete the entry. So it's a kind of level above. So yeah, edit is kind of all to do with changing the metadata, but manage is all about the kind of permission level things. Can you share a workflow with a space? Not directly. It would be through a team. So that space would have a team the workflow would be owned by the team. And then implicitly, the workflow is connected to the space.
But you can share it through the permissions. You can give us.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of permissions, yeah, you can choose to give people in space, like edit rights, for example, for your workflow entry. Can you delete old versions? You can't delete them, but you can hide them. So maybe, yeah, you had a broken version. You can choose to hide it, which essentially is the same thing. People won't be able to access that version, but yeah, it's kind of still there in the database. Can you add arbitrary metadata to a workflow other than what's automatically created? This is a good question. So yes is the short answer, but it depends what you mean by add. So we're kind of fixed to what we can show in the UI, but yeah, you've mentioned workflow arrow crate. So the metadata that you can supply in an arrow crate is extendable. You can put whatever you want in there. But what is displayed by WorkflowHub is kind of limited at the moment. So yeah, you could add extra metadata, but it wouldn't necessarily be visible in the UI. But then, you know, if someone downloaded that entry from WorkflowHub, all that metadata is still in there. So basically, yeah, you can add whatever you want, but we don't necessarily expose it directly.
Yeah. It's a bit more of an advanced topic, but it is used by some system like Life Monitor as well to have extra data that you need to pick up in the other end.
Yeah, so I have a bonus slide at the end where I'll talk a bit about that. Do you have a short list of best licenses for workflows? That's a good question. I think we do shortlist the licenses. Let me check.
Yeah, there's like 4 or 5 on the top.
So we recommend, yeah, we have a recommended list at the top. So these are kind of quite common licenses that people use. We're not legal experts, so we can't kind of advise what you're allowed to, which license is appropriate for your project, or what you're allowed to license given the you know, the copyright behind your workflow. But those are kind of commonly used licenses. I don't know if this is very visible on your guys' screen, but yes, all the MIT, GPL, and BSD and Apache licenses.
There's a couple more questions.
Yeah, just looking. Yeah, the steps pulled out from workflows. Is it possible for SnakeMake? That's also a really good question. It's something we're looking into, and it's something we'll talk about in session 3 more. But the answer is possibly, yeah, we can extract from SnakeMake. I mean, we'd certainly like to. There are a few options we're investigating, which I'll talk a bit more about in session 3. And a question from Julian, yeah. So yes, it is possible. And to be honest, I didn't mean to sound like it's a really bad idea. It's definitely possible, and people are doing it. If you have multiple workflows in a repository, that's completely fine. Basically, you just add your workflow in the same way as I showed, but you basically be deciding which entry, which workflow in that repository you want this WorkflowHub entry to represent, because each entry in WorkflowHub is a single workflow. But whether in the background that's a repository with, you know, 10 different workflows in, it doesn't really matter. You just have to indicate which is the main workflow in that repository. So yeah, go on, Sian.
Yeah, I guess you could say it's a feature or a bug in that case that the citation file will be the same for every workflow.
Yeah, basically, The only complication is when you've kind of got these top level metadata files like the citation file, it's a bit ambiguous what it's referring to. That's kind of the main reasoning behind our advice to have one workflow per repository, but we do acknowledge it's very common to have multiple workflows in a repository, and it's something we want to improve our support for, definitely, because there are absolutely use cases where it makes more sense that way. All right, I think that's all the questions.
Yep, and we're just
So
about back on time.
Great. So this session, we'll talk a little bit about the support for workflow systems. So like I said multiple times, WorkflowHub is system agnostic. So we support all types of workflow system, but also we kind of have dedicated support for certain workflow systems that are kind of prolific in the communities that we work with. And for those systems, we can do things like we can extract metadata, we can extract the internals, the structure of the workflow. We can generate diagrams in some cases, or display previews, which we do for Jupyter notebooks. So if you register a Jupyter notebook, you can kind of see the rendered version of that in WorkflowHub. And yeah, I mean, there's kind of cross-platform metadata formats we support as well, like the citation file that I mentioned. So what does it actually mean to add a workflow type to WorkflowHub, and why would you want to do this? So here in the lower left, you can see some workflow types that have been added to WorkflowHub by users. And what this lets you do is it lets you kind of filter over workflows from that type. So instead of just being a mysterious other workflow, you can say, you know, it's Janice workflow, it's a Scipion workflow, Scipion, and you can kind of link to that project's website, for example, where people can kind of see what that format is, what it's all about. And basically, yeah, it's a way of kind of collecting together workflows from various types. I think we've been told that there's over 300 workflow systems out there in the wild, so it didn't really make sense for us to have specific support for a fixed list of workflow systems. So that's why we kind of provide this flexibility. So I'll just go through a couple of the types we have dedicated support for. So Galaxy is probably the most supported type we have. So we can do kind of deep parsing of the Galaxy format to get at the internals. We can actually parse out what tools are used in the workflow, which then you can kind of go to bio.tools to see information about. Also in the filters, when you're browsing workflows, you could filter workflows that have a specific tool, because maybe you want to see some other examples of workflows that use a tool that you like to use in your workflow. So this is possible through the filtering system. I mentioned briefly that we support the TRS API, which is the Tools Registry Service API. So this is an API that tool or workflow providers can implement in their systems that allow people wanting to execute workflows or systems wanting to execute workflows to pull workflows from that registry. So this is used by Galaxy. So from within Galaxy, you can browse WorkflowHub, and it uses this API to present all the Galaxy workflows in WorkflowHub. And then with one click, you can import that into the Galaxy instance for execution. And it's not just Galaxy using that API, there are other systems using it too. It's another example of kind of interoperability because it's a standard API format that lots of registries implement. So I also added a link to BioTools on this slide if you want to check out what BioTools actually is. Another format we have quite strong support for is CWL, which is the common workflow language. So some brief background on CWL. It's kind of an initiative to create a workflow description language that is not necessarily tied to a particular execution platform. So again, we support deep parsing of this. We can extract the inputs, outputs, and steps from CWL descriptions. Additionally, we can produce diagrams from the CWL description, which I've given an example of here. And one cool thing that CWL can be used for is to describe other workflow formats. So given the huge number of workflow formats that exist, we kind of opted to have this concept in WorkflowHub of abstract CWL. And what that is it's basically a way of describing a workflow using CWL, whereas the original workflow may not have been produced using CWL. It may be a Galaxy workflow, it may be something else. So this will be useful for systems that kind of don't necessarily have a format that is easy to parse or interpret. They could opt to produce a CWL description of that format, which kind of gives an idea of what the inputs are, what the outputs are. And it doesn't necessarily have to be executable. It just kind of describes the structure of the workflow. So this is kind of something we're actively working with various workflow management systems to help them produce CWL descriptions for their workflows. Future work in this area would be kind of around extending our metadata support for additional workflow formats. So yeah, SnakeMake is definitely something that we want to look into, as well as Nextflow. And we've had chats with communities from both those projects to get this kicked off. I know in the Slido, initially we had people indicating what workflow systems they were using. I think Airflow is in there as well. So that would be also nice to support Airflow. There's obviously different levels of metadata we can extract depending on how open the format is, but we can kind of make a best effort. We also want to kind of deepen our metadata extraction for existing formats we support. So for example, identifying sub-workflows within a workflow and automatically linking those to the appropriate WorkflowHub entries if they exist. So maybe you have like a parent workflow that calls out to some sub-workflows, each with their own WorkflowHub entry. I think it would be really nice to kind of link those between each other in the interface. And also kind of more tool identification and extraction instead of just for Galaxy workflows. We want to expand that to other types if we can. Oops. So are there any questions about workflow format support or anything you want to?
So I would just say what was on that poll. So there's 1 Galaxy, no Nextflow, 3 SnakeMake, 4 Jupyter, and 1 Airflow. That's what I see on there.
Yeah, so SnakeMake's definitely something we should be focusing on, I think. Stian says in the chat, 336 workflow systems that are known.
I've put the link in the notes if anyone wants to click that now or later.
Cool.
Since we had several North Jupyter people, could you show briefly what is the Jupyter? How do you even do Jupyter notebooks?
So I'll go to WorkflowHub. Let's look at what workflows we have. 24 Jupyter workflows. There's one I was looking at before, which was a nice one. Was it this one? No, I don't think it was this one. Okay. So basically what you're seeing here is a rendered version of the Jupyter notebook. So obviously if you're familiar with Jupyter, you'll know how this looks, but it's just an example of a rich preview that we support.
So when we said Jupyter notebooks for workflows, obviously you have to be somewhat well behaved in your workflow for that to make sense, just like in many other languages. So if you say open files from your local file system, then that's not easily going to work as someone else's machine. I think your example there is good because it also included the Conda environment, and that's also useful if you want to launch this in my binder.
Yeah, so I mean, something we're trying to kind of collect together is all the best practices for different workflow systems. So we want to have a kind of documentation page in our website that links off to all the various best practices for different workflow systems, because obviously there are varying things that you need to do depending on which workflow system you're using. So that's one of our activities, is collecting together that kind of information. All right. If there are no questions here, I'll just go into some of the bonus topics I wanted to mention. So firstly is about RO-Crate. So RO-Crate, RO stands for Research Object. Basically, it's a way of collecting files and metadata together in a single bundle. So you can kind of describe how each thing in there is related to each other thing. And you can supply metadata about who created those things, who should be credited, things like that. That's something we're using in WorkflowHub. We use the workflow RO-Crate format, which is a kind of subset of RO-Crate, which is described on the top link. So basically, it gives you most of the metadata, well, all the metadata you can see in the WorkflowHub UI. You can kind of download into an RO-Crate, and that's kind of portable then. You could perhaps upload that to another system that supports the RO-Crate format.
For instance, the workflow execution service from Barcelona can execute this.
Yeah, so for example, for execution, you can have everything bundled up in a single package. It can be used for that. Workflow testing. So this kind of is related to RO-Crate. In fact, I'll show this. So we integrate with a system called Life Monitor, which basically is a way of monitoring the health of a workflow, let's say. So I've just scrolled down the filters, and you can see we have this tests filter. So I can find all my workflows that have tests that are passing. So basically what Life Monitor does is, if you are testing your workflow maybe using GitHub Actions or Jenkins or something, you can create a workflow testing RO crate, we call it, which basically contains metadata that links all these places where test results can be found for this workflow. And then what Life Monitor does is it periodically checks in with these test cases and indicates, is the workflow still working? And this is kind of important because, workflows make use of various services and tools which can kind of change and decay over time. So we kind of use this service to display this test indication on WorkflowHub. It's a little bit more advanced on how you can produce these workflow testing RO crates, which is why we didn't cover it in today's session. But I've linked to the Life Monitor documentation where you can kind of find out a bit more about that if you're interested. There's a question about RO crate, which I'll answer now. What is the minimum metadata for an RO crate? So for a general RO crate, I think there's like no metadata requirements, but for our workflow RO crate, we list the requirements here. Basically, you have to have a workflow in there, obviously, and you have to indicate that this workflow is the main workflow of the RO crate. And everything else is optional, but you need to say what the workflow type is. And we give some examples of workflow types and supported licenses on this page, as well as an example of what the metadata would look like. But these, this is something you probably wouldn't produce by hand. You'd be using some kind of tool to produce this. So don't be put off by the fact it looks quite complex. There are various tools and libraries that are being used to produce RO crates and the metadata. So I'll just mention API access briefly. So I talked about the TRS API. We also have an API for submitting RO crates to WorkflowHub to kind of push them in. Not sure if anyone here is kind of thinking about WorkflowHub at that level, but if you are, we have documentation on the WorkflowHub about site on all the various APIs that WorkflowHub supports. And yeah, this last point I kind of covered already, but WorkflowHub isn't just workflows. There are other things you can upload to there and link to, such as SOPs or protocols, publications, presentations, documents and data files, various things we support.
If you could show those.
I can show them, yeah. I don't think we have many currently, but let me find a good tab. So yeah, you can see on the menu here, these are the different resources that are available. So you can link off to publications. This is integrated with PubMed and DOIs as well. So if you want to register your publication, basically you just enter the DOI here and it will pull in all the metadata and the abstract and things like that. So yeah, I mean, one common theme is we're trying to avoid people having to fill out large forms if possible. So we try and do a lot of automated metadata extraction.
This here had a relation to our workflow.
Yes, so you can relate things together. I don't know if this doesn't link to a workflow itself, but you can make connections between resources. All right, should I show anything else there, or?
I think we're kind of on schedule, so I don't know if people online want to ask to
There
see
was
something.
a section. I was just going to plug the WorkflowHub Club.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we meet every 2 weeks to talk about WorkflowHub and surrounding activities. So if you want to get involved in this at all, the link here is for details. Next meeting is on the 12th of July. Sorry. We also have a Slack channel. I've put a shared invite. I'm not entirely sure it works, but if you want to talk about workflows or WorkflowHub, you can join our Slack team. And yeah, now is the time if you have any other questions about WorkflowHub or any other sessions that didn't get covered, now would be the time to ask anything else.
There's nothing else on the slide at the moment.
Yeah, I'll just give it a few minutes. If not, we can check out a bit earlier.
Yeah, I think we lost maybe 10 people.
All right.
Are there any more plans for like a more advanced workshop?
Not now, but if there's interest, we could run something more advanced. I mean,
yeah,
the place to discuss that would be at the WorkflowHub Club or in the Slack.
Or maybe a follow-on with RO Cray or something.
Yeah. All right, then I'll just plug some acknowledgements. So yeah, these are all the projects that are funded or contributed towards WorkflowHub. Some people here representing those. So yep. Hopefully I didn't miss anyone. But otherwise, yeah, thanks for joining today. I'll let Nick do the sign off if we're doing that.
Yeah, I think so. If there's no more questions, I think we can get half an hour of our lives back and get a coffee. And anyone interested in kind of follow-ups, I saw Jesse's message. Maybe you can get in touch with us and we can forge the interest and take it from there. But thank you everyone for coming. I think it was very useful. Thanks very much, Finn, for presenting. That was great. I learned quite a lot myself.
Oh, thank you for hosting.
No problem. Okay, in that case, thank you everyone. Take care.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye.
We'll end the call here.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
Did Finn already leave?
Yeah.
I thought we'll just have a few minutes of chat. No, he's gone.
We can ask him to come back.
Yeah. So I just had one comment, but maybe I should give it to Finn. So Finn is not here, so it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. There's still one participant left. He's probably AFK or something.
Yeah.
Or we can have a quick call afterwards.
I'd be like, yeah, we've got a bit of time to spare before the next meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just straight after, but I thought it went really well.
Yeah, I think that there are two things that I have to say. One is, okay, that's when Finn comes in. But the second thing is, do you think that, you know, a 2-hour session, like people are as engaged throughout the session?
I'll tell you what I think some of the problem is that most meetings these days are like 1 hour slots.
Yeah.
1 hour slots. And if you join something online for 2 hours, probably you've got to do something else at the same time, or you've got a meeting either before. Because we started off and we had, I don't know, 15 something people, and I think it went up to like 28 at one point.
Yeah.
And then at the end again, it's back down to about 15. So I think people come in late from calls, attend, and then some have to disappear. But the recording is really good. Oh, have you stopped recording?
Recording now.
And